Hey guys, tonight we bidgin topic, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the light. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So Uvethi candle flickers low in the corner of the monastery apothecary. Shadows stretch across tightly rolled scrolls, dried bundles of yarrow, and ceramic jars labeled in Latin. A physician of the 13th century, wrapped in a woolen robe, carefully adjusts his spectacles and reads aloud. Lactuca sativa, calming. To the bowels, harmful to the mind after sunset? Yes, lettuce. It's the same leafy green you might toss into your sandwich or eat with ranch dressing today. To medieval doctors, it was not a harmless salad ingredient. It was a plant of great power, sometimes healing, sometimes dangerously destabilizing. And after the sun dipped below the horizon, it was to be avoided with the same vigilance one might reserve for poisons. But how did this peculiar belief come to pass? To understand, you must imagine the world as they did not, as a place governed by molecules and microbes, but by humors, for bodily fluids that dictated health, personality, and even the fate of nations. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. These humors had to be in perfect balance. Too much black bile, melancholy, and sluggishness. Too much blood, frenzied and feverish. Now lettuce, known by its Latin name, Lactuca sativa, was believed to have a cooling, moistening effect on the body. That made it useful for quelling heat and calming frenzied minds. It helped the melancholic. It soothed the bilious. It was even used as a mild sedative, especially for patients struggling with fevers or fits of passion. But therein lay the danger. You see, nighttime was already considered a time of natural cooling. As the sun went down, the body, like the world, became colder and wetter. To add lettuce into the mix, with its deeply cooling properties, was to tip the balance too far. One could become dangerously lethargic. The humors might turn inward. The body could become too phlegmatic, inviting ailments like coughs, consumption, or even paralysis. In fact, some texts warned that lettuce at night could disturb dreams and open the soul to dark spirits. Let's step back for a moment and look at the texts where these fears first appear. Ancient roots of lettuce lore long before the medieval world took lettuce to task. Ancient physicians had already planted the seed of fear. Hippocrates himself noted that lettuce had calming properties, but should be used with prudence. Galen, that towering figure of Roman medicine whose work dominated European thought for over a millennium, wrote extensively about lettuce. He categorized it as cold in the second degree and moist in the second degree technical terms in humorism. That placed lettuce squarely in the dangerous, if misused, category. Galen's writings, combined with Arabic medical knowledge which had preserved and expanded on the Greco-Roman traditions, reinforced the lettuce nighttime taboo. When translated into Latin during the 11th and 12th centuries by monks and scholars, in Toledo and Salerno, these warnings spread across Europe like a creeping vine. The 12th century physician Constantine the African compiled these teachings in his influential texts. He warned explicitly against eating lettuce before bed, stating that it chills the stomach and slackens the sinews, according to him. Lettuce closes the eye of reason, a poetic way of saying it made you dull-witted and foggy-brained. Was any of this true? Not exactly. But science, as it was practiced then, wasn't about truth in our modern sense. It was about observation, correlation, and survival. Lettuce in practice. Medieval prescriptions, despite its ominous reputation after dark, lettuce was still prescribed during the day for various ailments. Monastic herbals and medical treatises listed it as a remedy for fevers, insomnia, ironically, and even lust. Yes, lust. The belief was that lettuce had an anaphrodisiac effect. It cooled the passions, quelled desires, and soothed the restless spirit. For monks and nuns trying to maintain their vows of chastity, a daytime salad might have seemed like a spiritual aid. However, once the sun went down, physicians changed their tune. A 14th century English physician, writing under the name Gilbertus Anglicus, included a stern note: "Let no man of delicate constitution partake of lettuce in the gloaming hour, for it dulleth the faculties and invites the sleep of death." Whether he meant literal death or simply a metaphor for deep, unresponsive sleep is unclear. But the fear was real. Imagine, then, the dinner table of a modest, noble household in the year 1324. A servant lays out bread, cheese, stewed lentils, and a small bowl of greens. A child reaches for the lettuce. The mother, a woman who has read herbal scrolls inherited from her grandmother, snatches it away, whispering a prayer under her breath. The danger was not in the plant itself, but in the time of day. Cultural myths and nighttime fears beyond the humoral theory. Nighttime in the medieval world was a time of mystery and vulnerability. Darkness carried spiritual significance. It was when demons traveled freely, when dreams were thought to reveal divine or diabolical messages, and when the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual thinned. In this context, eating lettuce, already associated with sleep and dulled senses, was seen as an invitation for unclean spirits to enter. A sleeping body under the influence of a cooling herb was like a house with the doors left open. The soul, unguarded, might be tampered with. Folktales from rural France spoke of children who fell into trances after eating lettuce too late. In southern Italy, certain healers insisted that no lettuce be grown on the northern side of the garden. It would grow cold hearts. Whether these tales reflected genuine belief or merely superstition woven into rural life is hard to say. But the idea of lettuce as a twilight hazard lingered. Even church physicians, those who tended to monks and abbots, reported unusual symptoms in patients who had consumed lettuce before Compline, the final prayer service of the night. Slow speech, drowsiness beyond reason, forgetfulness. Was it the lettuce, or the long hours of prayer and poor nutrition? That question was never truly resolved. Scientific speculation? Was there something to it? Not. Modern science does recognize that lettuce, particularly the wild variety, Lactuca virosa, contains lactucium, a milky substance sometimes referred to as lettuce opium. It has very mild sedative properties. Could the lettuce of medieval times have contained higher levels of this compound than today's crisp iceberg or romaine? Possibly. Could it, under certain conditions, have contributed to drowsiness or altered dreams? Perhaps. But the fears of the medieval doctors weren't based on chemical analysis. They were based on observation, tradition, and the deep human instinct to find patterns in the unknowable. Which leads us to an unsettling question that those medieval physicians may have pondered as they extinguished their candles and lay
down to sleep.
If lettuce could soothe the body and dull the mind, what else could it do when no one was watching? You awaken in the dim quiet of a 14th century monastery garden. The bells have not yet tolled for lauds, the morning prayer. Thin mist clings to the soil, and rows of herbs, sage, rue, thyme, and lavender stand in obedient rows under the gaze of Brother Wulfric, the apothecary. Near the wall, the lettuce patch. He eyes it warily. The lettuce plants glisten with dew. By all appearances, they are innocent enough. Slightly curled leaves, pale green at the tips, and the faintest smell of earth and milk. Dew. But to Brother Wulfricond? Many like him across Europe, they represent a delicate gamble between medicine and misfortune. See, lettuce had begun to occupy a strange middle ground in medieval herbal lore. On the one hand, it was listed in the great compendia of healing plant texts, such as the Tequinum Sanitatis, a health handbook translated from Arabic into Latin, which recommended lettuce for hot-tempered men, overindulged courtiers, and sleep-starved monks. On the other hand, anecdotes abounded of people falling ill after eating lettuce under the wrong moon phase, or too close to bedtime, or in the company of certain foods. Take, for example, the case of Lady Matilda of Kent, written on a dusty parchment dated 1377. She suffered from phantasms of the night, we might now call night terrors. Her physician had prescribed boiled lettuce before evening prayers. On the third night, she fell into a stupor from which she did not awaken until noon the next day. Her attendants whispered of spirits. The doctor insisted it was an overcorrection. Of the humors, the herbalists blamed the lettuce. Even among gardeners, lettuce came with rules. You were not to water it after sunset, lest the dampness creep into the root and corrupt its virtue. You must never harvest lettuce on the new moon, when its cooling properties were believed to be at their peak, and one must never, under any circumstance, sleep in a field of growing lettucean. Old wives' tale claimed this invited restless dreams, or even death. But why death? To answer that, we must explore the curious intersection of botany, belief, and burial practices. Lettuce in the gardens of death in many parts of Europe, lettuce was associated not just with sleep, but with death itself. Were intimately linked in medieval cosmology. Death was considered a form of permanent sleep. Sleep was a small death, a temporary wandering of the soul. And so, any substance that encouraged too deep a sleepy one like lettuce invited speculation and fear. In ancient Roman mythology, which still informed Christian European beliefs well into the Middle Ages, lettuce had a grim connection to Adonis, the handsome youth loved by Venus. According to legend, Adonis died in a bed of lettuce after being gored by a boar. The plant was thereafter associated with male sterility, stillness, and death. Roman funeral feasts sometimes included lettuce as a symbol of the final sleep. This folklore traveled across centuries, embedded in quiet rituals and whispered warnings. While Christian monks no longer worshipped Venus, they had inherited the idea of lettuce as a plant of stillness. It meant it had to be handled carefully, expected, but not trusted. Apothecaries sometimes burned dried lettuce at funerals as a purifying incense. In certain regions of the Holy Roman Empire, lettuce seeds were sown into burial shrouds to cool the soul's journey. Some early Christian mystics even claimed that angels visited the dying more gently if their rooms smelled faintly of boiled lettuce. Perhaps these ideas are not so different from today's lavender-scented death rituals. But in the medieval world, lettuce bore a heavier spiritual weight. A night in the infirmary, let us now follow a patient Brother Oswin, a monk suffering from headaches and insomnia. His symptoms are typical for a man of letters: excessive study, little sleep, and far too much time bent over parchment under dim candlelight. The monastery physician, adhering to Galenic principles, prescribes him a poultice of crushed lettuce leaves, mixed with vinegar to be applied to the forehead during the day. It will cool your thoughts, the physician explains. But do not consume it past dusk, lest your mind be taken too far from the light. Oswin, skeptical but obedient, follows the regimen. By the third day, his headaches lessen. But on the fourth evening, hunger strikes late. Without thinking, he eats a small portion of leftover stewed greens, mostly cabbage and, unfortunately, some lettuce. That night he dreams of drowning. The dream, he's walking through a field of lettuce that grows taller and taller until it becomes a forest. The leaves close over him. A cold wind howls through them. He wakes gasping for breath. In the morning, he reports the dream to the abbot. The lettuce is blamed, of course. A cleansing prayer is performed. No punishment is given, only a stern warning: the plant that calms the day may disturb the night. While the story seems melodramatic to our modern ears, it reflects the real unease surrounding the consumption of certain foods at certain times. In a world without refrigeration, antibiotics, or scientific knowledge of toxins, food could indeed be dangerous, and patterns, real or imagined, were everything. The silent green in noble courts among the nobility, lettuce had a complicated role. It was fashionable to eat exotic or imported foods, preserved lemons, almonds, dried figs, and certain herbs from the Mediterranean. Lettuce, being easy to grow, was considered lowly, yet its health benefits kept it in demand. Cooks were instructed to prepare it in ways that neutralized its coldness. Wilted over warm wine, mixed with spices like cumin or cinnamon, fried in goose fat with shallots. The idea was not flavor, but balance. Food had to counteract itself. In one menu preserved from the court of Charles V of France, lettuce was listed on the midday meal but never on the evening spread. His personal physician, Guy de Chauliac, was a staunch follower of humorism and even noted in his surgical manual: that lettuce was not to be trusted with the fading of the light. Still, the rules were broken from time to time. And in the diary of a 15th century noblewoman, one finds the brief but telling line, "Ate lettuce before vespers, slept fitfully, dreamt of the dead again." No elaboration, just the sentence quiet, strange telling. A plant with a personality. In some medieval herbals, plants were given personalities, almost like spirits. Lettuce was seen as melancholic, like a sleepy librarian, reliable in small doses, dangerous if overindulged. One French herbalist called it the green with heavy eyelids. This idea shaped how people approached it, not as passive food, but as an active agent in their health and spiritual well-being. To eat lettuce was to ingest coolness, quiet, sleep, and sterility. That was fine in moderation during the heat of day. But at night, when spirits were near, the air was damp, and the body was most vulnerable. No, it was best to avoid it, just in case. Seeds of the future, interestingly. The fear of lettuce at night began to wane in the 16th and 17th centuries, as Renaissance physicians challenged Galenic medicine and began experimenting with anatomy, chemistry, and individual case studies. Lettuce's association with sleep remained, but the strict warnings about nighttime consumption began to disappear. Still, in rural parts of Europe, echoes of the old belief lingered. In one Austrian folk tale collected in the 1800s, a grandmother warns her grandchildren not to eat salad after sunset, lest they dream of cold places. In a Swiss mountain village, lettuce was not planted near graves, for fear it might keep souls from resting. And even today, some folk traditions advise against heavy, leafy greens at dinner, not for reasons of humorism, but digestion.
How much
of this fear was based on truth, and how much was simply caution in an age when caution was all one had? And so we are left with a curious thought. Could it be that our ancestors weren't entirely wrong, and that perhaps even now, the humble let us hold secrets we have forgotten to fear? The final chapter in our tale of leafy superstition does not end in fire or plague or the thunderclap of revelation, but rather, like all things, boring history for sleep, with slow changes over time, quiet rediscoveries, and the fading echo of ancient fears. By the early 16th century, the medieval world was beginning to fracture. New knowledge trickled through the cracks. Maps reshaped continents. Telescopes redefined the heavens, and scalpel blades uncovered the hidden workings of the human body. And yet, in garden after garden, in city and countryside, lettuce still grew, cautiously planted in rows, prepared thoughtfully, and rarely eaten after dusk. But why? Why does this soft, inoffensive vegetable, so easily overlooked, linger in the memory of superstition? What made it so particularly symbolic of the tension between night and day, life and death, and calm and vulnerability? To answer that, we must return to the garden. The monastic legacy of lettuce, even as Renaissance medicine began challenging, the old humoral doctrines, monasteries, remained bastions of traditional practice. Within their walls, the rhythms of nature and prayer kept time. Cultivation of herbs, fruits, and vegetables was not just a matter of nutrition, it was a sacred act. And lettuce, like thyme or yarrow, was a tool of spiritual balance. Preserved monastic record from the Abbey of Cluny details the gardening practices of the brothers. Lettuce was planted in neat, rotating rows. It was harvested before noon, washed in spring water, and served with vinegar, never oil. Why vinegar? Because it was warming, drying, and balancing. The brothers recorded symptoms after meals, treating lettuce like a medicine. Brother Roland reports a looseness of speech. Brother Matthew complains of forgetfulness after the midday meal. Brother Hugo rested, well attributed to the light bitterness of the greens. In some abbeys, lettuce was grown in covered beds, believed to alter its potency. Others avoided growing it near certain herbs, fearing interaction with restless plants like mandrake or henbane. We may laugh today at such notions, but in truth, these monks were early scientists. Observed, recorded, compared, and adjusted their treatments based on subtle clues. What they lacked in modern understanding, they made up for in attention. And so lettuce, that drowsy herb, remained part of the monastic pharmacopoeia honored, but hedged with warnings. A vegetable in the age of enlightenment, with the Enlightenment came a breaking of old bonds. Physicians like Andreas Vesalius, William Harvey, and Paracelsus rejected ancient doctrine in favor of direct observation. Anatomy replaced astrology. Chemistry began to challenge alchemy, but lettuce remained. Its reputation shifted. No longer feared as a nocturnal hazard, it began to be embraced for its calming effects. The French called it la lachue, from Latin. Lactuca, meaning milky one, a reference to the white sap released when cut. This sap, lactucarium, was eventually isolated and tested in the 19th century for its sedative properties. The herbalist William Salmon, writing in the early 1700s, noted that wild lettuce induces gentle sleep without the danger of opiates. It was recommended for ladies of nerves and overworked clergymen. Physicians began prescribing lettuce extract in tinctures. One 1847 medical guide from London offered a recipe: infusion of wild lettuce, taken 1 hour before bedtime, ensures natural repose without the dreams brought by poppy or laudanum. What had once been a feared after-dinner menace was now a sleep aid, and yet some older warnings persisted. Rural practitioners in Wales still advised against lettuce for patients with cold temperaments. Certain midwives avoided it in late pregnancy, believing it slowed the child's stirring. And perhaps if you searched long enough, you could still find an elderly gardener, maybe in the foothills of Italy or the highlands of Scotland, who would tell you, without irony, don't eat lettuce after dark. Bad for the head. It makes you dream of old. Ghosts. The dreaming herb in modern science. Fast forward to the 20th century. Nutritionists, chemists, and botanists studied lettuce like any other vegetable, classifying it by type: romaine, butterhead, crisp head, and loose leaf. Its vitamin content was charted. Its genetics were explored, but still, there was that question of lacticarium, the sleepy substance at the heart of all those medieval fears. Was there anything to it? The answer is yes, but only just. Dicarium is a mild sedative found primarily in wild lettuce, Lactuca virosa. In high doses, it can cause drowsiness, a slight slowing of heart rate, and, in some cases, vivid dreams. It's nowhere near as potent as opium or valerian root, but it is not inert. Some homeopathic sleep aids still include it today. However, the amount in most cultivated lettuce, like the kind you find in your grocery store salad, is negligible. Modern scientists have debunked the myth that lettuce steals energy after dark. And yet, even among health enthusiasts, a curious caution persists. Avoid heavy greens at night. Not for spiritual reasons, but for digestion. Even now, remnants of medieval wisdom resurface in new clothes. The psychology of sleep and salad. It turns out that much of the lettuce fear may have been rooted not in plant biology, but in psychology. To eat lettuce is to eat something light, cooling, and quiet. It does not excite the palate. It does not warm the stomach. It slows the meal, prepares the body, whether intentionally or not, for stillness. And in a time before clocks, screens, and nighttime electricity, that stillness was profound. The medieval man who ate lettuce with his midday bread might have welcomed the drowsiness that followed. But if he ate it after sunset, when wolves howled and candles flickered and spirits were said to wander, that drowsiness might have felt like danger. After all, in an age where survival depended on awareness of raiders, of storms, of fire and flood, falling too deeply asleep was a kind of vulnerability. One lettuce leaf too many could feel like courting risk. This was not foolishness. It was prudence, shaped by centuries of lived experience. And perhaps in some quiet way it still makes sense. To avoid heavy foods at night. To respect sleep. To fear the veil between waking and dreaming. Just a little. Closing the garden gate, so now we return to the garden, the one you imagined. Dim and misty, with rows of herbs, and a wary monk checking the lettuce bed. What began as an ordinary plant became, through centuries of caution, story and ritual, a symbol of balance, of sleep, of unseen risks. To medieval doctors, lettuce was not just food. It was a reminder that health was fragile, The body could be tipped off balance by the subtlest forces. That nightfall was not to be taken lightly. And maybe as you lie in bed tonight and think of monks and manuscripts and the curious warnings of old, you'll remember the quiet green that lulled kings to sleep, soothed anxious priests, and inspired countless dreams, good and bad. Not so boring after all. But then again, why did they believe dreams turned darker with lettuce? What other foods carried similar fears? You are walking down a cobbled street in late 14th century London. The air smells faintly of ash, stale, beer, and wet wool. The church bells echo through narrow alleys, and across the square a procession of young noblemen saunters past. Their cloaks billow dramatically in the cold wind, but it's their shoes that stop you. They are absurd. Pair longer than the man's actual foot by several inches, curled like ram's horns, decorated with bells, dyed in crimson or black, and embroidered with silver thread. The toes alone extend so far ahead that the men walk with a gait more theatrical than natural. You've just seen the height of fashion, the poulain or krakoa, shoe with a point so long it could nearly trip its wearer. In the decades to come, this peculiar trend would lead to sermons, scandals, satire, and eventually a royal ban. 'Cause pointy shoes, it turned out, were far more than a strange fashion. They were a symbol of sin, pride, and the decadence of a society walking its way toward ruin, or so thought one very serious king. But before the ban came the boom. The origins of the pointed shoe, though most famously associated with medieval England and France, pointed shoes didn't originate there. The poulain, a word derived from Poland, likely found its way into Western Europe via foreign merchants, soldiers, or royal marriages. The first recorded references to these shoes appear in the mid-1300s. One chronicler wrote that in Krakow, men wore shoes so long and curled that they tied the toes to their shins with laces of gold. By the 1360s, the trend had leaped across borders. In France, the shoes became known as crocos, while in England they were called poulains. At first they appeared only in noble courts and among the wealthy. But fashion, like all things contagious, spreads. Soon, guild merchants, knights, and even ambitious peasants were commissioning pointed shoes. Cobblers competed to outdo one another in flair. Some shoes extended 6 to 10 inches beyond the foot. Wealthy lords had their shoe tips reinforced with whalebone or wire so they could stand upright. The length of your shoe became a statement. The longer the toe, the higher your status. And the church took notice.
Ow.
Pride at the tip of a toe clergy in the 14th century were deeply concerned about. Outward displays of pride. To them, the human body was not a canvas for vanity, but a vessel for salvation. Clothes were meant to be functional, modest, and reflective of one's station. But the poulains were the very opposite. They exaggerated the body. They called attention. To the feet, worst of all, they were often worn by those who, in the church's view, should not be strutting in luxury minor nobles, court officials, even clergymen themselves. Preachers took to the pulpit, denouncing the shoes as instruments of the devil. One friar in Paris thundered, "God did not give man feet to mock him with talons of pride." In London, a sermon was preserved in which the preacher asked, "Can the sinner outrun judgment with shoes longer than his own virtue?" Satirists joined in. In one anonymous manuscript from Flanders, a cartoon depicts a man tripping over his shoe tip and falling headlong into the mouth. His shoelaces are devoured by demons. The pointy shoe had become a symbol not just of fashion but of foolishness, vanity, and social decay. But still, people kept wearing them. A royal foot down enter, King Edward IV of England. It was the 1460s, and the War of the Roses was raging. Edward, having taken the throne in a bloody and bitter civil war, now had the unenviable task of bringing order to a fractured kingdom. He wanted stability, dignity, and control. And to Edward, the shoes were a problem, not because they were ridiculous though they were, but because they represented a deeper issue: social disorder. Young men of lower rank were dressing like nobility. There was no visual hierarchy anymore. The line between peasant and lord was blurring dangerous in a time when appearance defined one's place in the feudal machine. In 1463, King Edward issued a royal proclamation. No person under the estate of a lord shall wear any shoes or boots with pikes exceeding 2 inches in length, under pain of forfeiture. This was more than a sartorial footnote. It was a direct attempt to restore visible order through clothing. The king wanted people to look like who they were supposed to be. Long shoes made the poor appear rich. That, to Edward, was dangerous. The order was enforced by city officials. Shoemakers could be fined for selling illegal shoes. Tailors were warned not to sew clothing above the station of the wearer. The kingdom would be kept neat, orderly, and free of curled toes by law. Shoemakers, subversion, and shoelaces of resistance, of course. Not everyone obeyed. Some shoemakers simply adjusted their designs, adding clever bends and folds to make the toes look shorter. Others sewed the points upwards so dramatically that they looked decorative rather than functional. A few began to hide the offending tips beneath robes or extra-long tunics. There are even stories of rebellious young men in London who wore the longest pelanes possible in public as an act of defiance, what we might now call proto-punk fashion. And just as laws restrict, fashion adapts. The duckbill shoe soon replaced the plain, a flat, wide, exaggerated slipper that spread out like a fan. Where once the foot extended forward in pride, now it widened in display. The fashion had shifted, but the need to express wealth and rebellion through footwear remained. Meanwhile, in the countryside and among the working poor, practical shoes never went out of style. Leather boots, ankle wraps, or simple wooden clogs remained the staple. But the long-toed shoe had made its mark. It had walked into court, marched into sermons, strutted into satire, and then not last been banned. The quiet echoes of a bizarre fashion, you might ask. Why does any of this matter? Because, in the end, the pointy shoe was not just about style. It was about identity. Clothing has always been used to mark who belongs and who doesn't. In medieval society, where social mobility was rare, fashion was one of the few ways to visually pretend to be someone else. The length of a toe became a signal of ambition, wealth, or satire, and the royal ban. That wasn't just about shoes, it was about holding on to a vision of the world that was slipping away. In the centuries that followed, the poulain would appear again in paintings, plays, and costume balls. Shakespeare would mock it. Victorian historians would marvel at it. And even today, fashion designers occasionally resurrect at runways, featuring impossible, angular footwear that nods to a time when shoes meant more than comfort. But perhaps the most curious thing is this. Why did they believe the toe should be long in the first place? What ancient idea gave rise to the idea that the farther your foot extended, the higher you stood? That's a question we'll explore. Next one, the poulain becomes more than fashion and enters the realm of myth, masculinity, and the medieval mind. Let us begin not in the cobbled courts of England, but in the ancient temples of Egypt, where carvings of gods and kings often exaggerate the body in curious ways. From there, to the dusty clay tablets of Mesopotamia, to the stone figures of early Greece across time, form has always implied function. Form has always been subject to metaphor. To exaggerate a body part is to say something without speaking. It is a kind of language, a display of status, power, or virility. So when medieval Europe adopted the absurdly elongated poulain, it did so with more than just fashion in mind. The pointy shoe was more than just a pointy shoe. To some, it was a symbol of wealth. To others, a symbol of pride. But to many, it was a symbol of something far more ancient and primal. Let's tread carefully now and follow the toe into the psychology of medieval masculinity, shoe and its shadow in the Middle Ages. Clothing was never merely clothing. Hood could signal humility or concealment. A belt might suggest chastity or invitation, and shoes pointed not just forward, but downward toward the earth, toward sin, toward mortality, or something else entirely. In various texts. From the late 14th and early 15th centuries, we find increasingly bold metaphors describing the poulain. French satirists wrote of men who extended themselves like serpents. A preacher in Ghent accused young nobles of pointing their shoes to mock heaven and tempt earth. More explicitly, a 1390s poem from a Benedictine monk in York suggests that the long toes were worn to draw the gaze to that which lies beneath. This wasn't a metaphor for modesty. A chronicler in Bruges writes that young men fastened their points with wire to preserve their shape for fashion, but also for posture, for pride, and to show what could not be shown. And so, the poulain took on a distinctly phallic symbolism, not always overt, not always acknowledged, but deeply, viscerally felt. It became a statement about manhood, potency, and the privilege to display both even, if indirectly. Clothing, class, and contained lust, you might wonder, why shoes? Why not hats or coats or rings? Because shoes are practical. They touch the earth. To make something so inherently functional into something utterly impractical was the ultimate. Luxury. A 10-inch shoe tip is not a toolid, is a declaration that one does not need tools. For the lower classes, farmers, smiths, and soldiers' shoes had to be durable. They were made of thick leather, reinforced with hobnails, and built to last. But for the nobility, a shoe could be delicate, flamboyant, and ridiculous. To wear. A curled poulain in the mud was to say, I do not labor. To wear it in winter was to say, I do not walk far. To wear it among commoners was to say, look upon my leisure. And so, the longer the shoe, the longer the list of things you did not need to do. It was conspicuous consumption's entries before the term was coined, but it wasn't just about class. The poulain intersected with another anxiety of the period, the fear of unregulated desire. The church, always wary of fashion, began to see the shoes as tools of vanity and lust. The length, the curve, the shimmer, it all seemed to draw the eye toward parts of the body meant to remain unnoticed. In one sermon from 1402, a Dominican friar warned that pointed shoes lead the heart to crooked thoughts. Another claimed they were horns of sin upon the feet of youth. To modern ears, these warnings may sound comical. But in a society where clothing was deeply moralized and where desire was feared as a path to damnation, shoes became serious business. Masculinity underfoot, the poulain became, in some sense, a battleground for medieval masculinity. In times of war, young men were celebrated for bravery, discipline, and sacrifice. But in times of peace, they often turned to fashion, poetry, and courtly games. The shoe became a stand-in for this shift, a visible reminder that society's ideals of manhood were changing. Conservative voices worried. What kind of man struts in ornamented footwear? What does it mean when men begin to dress not for work, or war, but for display? In some royal courts, the answer was control. In addition to Edward IV's ban, there were similar laws passed in France and Burgundy. In 1368, Charles V of France issued a sumptuary edict that included restrictions on shoe length. Burgundy followed suit in 1430, limiting toe extensions. Based on social rank, the rules were detailed. Knights could wear points up to 6 inches, merchants only 4 inches, commoners no point at all. The shoe had become a measuring stick for manhood, merit, and manners. Yet it never quite went away. Rebellion in leather and lace, even as the bans took effect, men found ways to stretch the rules literally, where some wore inner shoes with concealed extensions. Others tied ribbons around their ankles to simulate the upward curve of the forbidden point. The tension between desire and regulation only added to the appeal. The satirical poem Piers Plowman, written by William Langland in the late 1300s, features characters who wear shoon of crimson, curled at the toe like a scorpion's sting. The metaphor is clear. Shoes had become weapons, stingers, and extensions of pride and danger. In one court record from Norwich, a young nobleman was fined for publicly displaying toes in excess of the legal measure. Not fighting, stealing, but toe display. We mustn't laugh too quickly. Today we might obsess over brands, sneaker drops, or luxury heels. The medieval poulain was no different a fashion item, but also a symbol of rebellion, individuality, and indulgence. The slow unraveling by the early 1500s, the pointed shoe began to fade. not because of laws, but because of fashions. Relentless need for novelty. Shoes became broader. The duckbill style took over, flat, square, and comically wide. King Henry VIII himself wore such shoes, his broad-toed slippers often extending a full 6 inches sideways. Where once the foot pointed like a sword, now it sprawled like a paddle. The poulain, once a mark of masculine excess, became a relic of the past, mocked, parodied, and finally forgotten. But the cultural memory remained. Centuries later, Victorian historians would write with barely concealed delight about the excesses of the Middle Ages, always including an image of the ridiculous pointy shoe. And fashion historians today still reference the poulain win, tracing the history of gendered clothing, performance, and power. The foot, it seems, remembers. And so we are left with this strange question. What was it that made men, for nearly a century, elongate their feet to the edge of absurdity? And what does that say about how we express power when we feel most powerless? You are standing in a quiet museum room, centuries after the last poulain scuffed a cobbled street. The shoes lie behind glass, now one pair brown with age, another blackened and split at the curl. Their toe tips are still exaggerated, still ridiculous, still strangely elegant. You can almost hear the echo of their wearers, swaggering nobles, foppish poets, and rebellious young men. They are gone, of course, but the shoes remain. So what happens to a fashion after it dies? What happens to a symbol when no one remembers why it mattered? This is the strange afterlife of the pointed shoe. It never truly disappeared. It simply changed costume. The duckbill and the double bluff, by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the duckbill shoe had replaced the poulain. This new style was everything the previous one wasn't. Broad instead of narrow, blunt instead of pointed, and horizontal instead of vertical. But it wasn't more modest. If anything, it was louder. The wide shoes were often stuffed, puffed, and even slashed to reveal colored linings designed not for utility but for display. It was the same performance in a new outfit. Fashion, like history, does not travel in straight lines. It loops, it rebels, it overcompensates. One Tudor courtier wrote of shoes so broad they might have hosted supper upon them, mocking the duckbills as theatrical overreach. The satire had simply changed direction. Where once the toe tip pointed at pride, now the wit suggested gluttony and idleness. The fear for moralists and monarchs alike remained the same. Fashion was a mirror too honest to tolerate. Pointed shoes reborn, and yet the poulain never fully vanished. It slumbered, reappearing in subtle ways. In the 17th century, European cavalier boots often curled at the toe, a nod to flamboyance. In the 18th century, some theatrical costumes revived exaggerated points for comic or romantic effect. In the 19th century, romantic painters portrayed medieval lovers in curly-toed footwear, idealized and sanitized. But it was in the 20th century that the poulain saw its strangest rebirths. In the 1950s, winkle-picker sopped in British youth culture sharp, angular shoes worn by rock and roll fans and teddy boys. The name itself was absurd, referring to a tool used to extract shellfish, but the shape was unmistakable. The long toe had returned, now worn by young rebels with pomade and guitars instead of cloaks and courtly swords. Fashion historians noted the similarity with daylight, a bit of concern. And then, in the 2000s, pointed shoes returned again. Italian leather dress shoes, designer heels, runway spectacles with impossible silhouettes. We have been here before. The shape changes, but the impulse remains. Clothing as containment. In Rebellion, the story of the poulain is not just about shoes, it's about control. In the medieval world, clothes were tools of order. The church tried to limit temptation. Kings tried to limit rebellion. Town councils tried to limit confusion between classes. But every ban produced resistance, and every restriction invited creativity. The foot, constrained by custom and cobblestone, became a site of expression. It's a practical body part. It served movement. But as a symbolic one, it told stories about power, desire, excess, and rebellion. Just as hair was covered or unveiled to signify virtue or seduction, just as belts were tightened to imply purity or status, shoes said something strange. Something about where you stood, about whether you belonged, about whether you dared to step outside the expected line. No wonder the pointy shoe made people so uneasy. The forgotten laws and the quiet repeats Edward IV's shoe ban, like many sumptuary laws, was poorly enforced and largely ignored. It served its purpose as a gesture and assertion of royal authority during a time of instability. And then, like all such gestures, it was forgotten, but echoes of it remained. In 17th century Geneva, there were laws limiting the color of women's sleeves. In 19th century France, laws restricted trousers for women, technically not repealed until the 21st century. In parts of modern society, school uniforms, dress codes, and professional attire still reflect the same old tension. Clothing must express, but not too much. The fear that people might look richer, freer, or more powerful than they are, that's a fear that never quite goes away. The plain was only its most obvious expression. A thoughtful step forward, and so we come to the end of the tale. Tale not of battles or kings or revolutions, but of shoes. Pointy shoes, curled shoes, shoes that stood in for something deeper. You may be wondering, why does this matter? Because in telling the story of something seemingly trivial, like a ridiculous shoe, we discover how societies wrestle with identity, control, expression, and anxiety. The longer the toe, the louder the question. Who am I allowed to be? When? Edward IV banned long shoes. He wasn't just regulating fashion, he was trying to stitch the seams of a kingdom torn by war. When clergymen denounced curled toes, they weren't just being prudes, they were defending a vision of order. And when young men laced up shoes that turned their feet into elegant weapons of theater, they weren't just being vain, they were stepping into a story that, perhaps, never really ended. But now, as you lay your own feet to rest, perhaps, one question lingers. What other forgotten fashions once shook kingdoms and disturbed sleep? And what might your own shoes say about you in some future museum? You wake on a foggy morning in 19th century America. The sun, just rising behind the gray haze, does little to warm the wooden sidewalks of a small frontier town. The year is 1876. The place is somewhere in the rolling hills of the Midwest its name already. Forgotten in the folds of history. But something strange is happening. A group of men in suits stand solemnly on the courthouse steps. At their feet, in a fine oak coffin, lies the newly elected mayor, is dressed in his Sunday best, his hands crossed peacefully over his chest. The crowd stands in eerie silence, waiting. A young boy perched on the water trough whispers to no one in particular, "He won by 11 votes. The mayor is dead, but he has won." This is not fiction. The history of cadaver candidates, dead men winning elections, is as real and strange as anything found in folklore. It is one of those curious corners of political history where tragedy, bureaucracy, and public sentiment converge in ways both absurd and entirely understandable. But before we arrive at that small town and its dearly departed politician, we must take a slow step back and ask, why would anyone vote for a corpse? And more intriguingly, what does it say about the living? A long tradition of the dead speaking death, it turns out, has never been a full disqualification from political office. In ancient Rome, funerary speeches were often held in the Senate chambers with deceased patricians represented by relatives wearing wax death masks of the dead. In a symbolic sense, the voices of the past literally spoke through the mouths of the living. In medieval Europe, saints were granted spiritual authority long after death. Cathedrals consulted the bones of dead bishops. Monarchs ruled by the will of long-dead ancestors. And in some rural councils, the chair of a respected elder was left vacant for his wisdom to pass through. Symbolism mattered. So perhaps it is not so strange that the idea of honoring or electing the dead carried on into the more bureaucratic, paperwork-heavy systems of the 18th and 19th centuries. But in those cases, it wasn't saints or senators being honored. It was often regular people caught in the strange machinery of democracy. voting, paperwork, and the problem of timing to understand how a corpse might win an election. We need to consider the way voting worked in the 1800s. Elections were long, slow affairs. Ballots were printed locally, sometimes even handwritten. Votes were tallied manually, often days after polls closed. Communication was patchy. Candidate could campaign for weeks, fall ill. And the news might not reach voters until long after they cast their ballots. The most infamous early case of this phenomenon occurred in 1872. Presidential candidate Horace Greeley, a newspaper editor turned politician, ran against Ulysses S. Grant. Greeley, exhausted and mentally frayed from the bitter campaign, died. Just weeks after the election, but after some electoral votes had already been pledged in his name. Although Grant had won decisively, Greeley technically carried several states whose electors were left scrambling. They could not legally cast their vote for a dead man, so they split their ballots among several living politicians. It was the first time in U.S. history that a deceased candidate had such a visible impact on the Electoral College. The precedent was troubling. If death did not remove a name from the ballot, what did? And that brings us back to our small frontier town, where death arrived inconveniently, but not in vain. The town with a dead mayor, the town's real name, lost in some records but hinted at in others, has been reconstructed by historians simply as Dry Gulch, a placeholder. For the many such places that dotted the American interior in the late 1800s, what we do know is this. In the fall of 1876, a respected local blacksmith named Elijah K. Boggs was running for mayor. He had no party affiliation. He was by all accounts a man of steady hands, honest work, and community trust. He had helped build the town's first church steeple and forged nearly every horseshoe for 20 miles. He died 3 days before the election, pneumonia most likely. Slow and breathless departure. His death was known to the town, but not to the ballot printers. Certainly not to the county seat, which managed the formalities. There was no procedure for last-minute replacements. There was no contingency. And so, on election day, his name remained. Some thought it would be a symbolic gesture, a vote of mourning, one widow called it. Others saw it as a protest against the only other candidate, a man from the railway company with a reputation for shady land deals. Whatever the reasons, Elijah K. Boggs won. By 11 votes, so the people of Dry Gulch gathered in the town. Square as the coffin was lowered, not into the ground, but ceremonially carried to the courthouse porch. A wreath was laid on the mayor's desk. The keys to the town were placed atop his Bible. He never took office, of course. But the election was real. The result was valid. And his memory governed at least for a few months, as a placeholder, until a special election could be arranged. The strange legitimacy of it all, it might surprise you that this was entirely legal, at least at the time. Election laws rarely anticipated such situations. If a candidate died too close to election day, it was often impossible to revise ballots, especially in rural areas. Voters were left to choose, cast a vote for a living candidate. They didn't trust or vote for the deceased, knowing it would trigger a new election. In some cases, dead candidate was preferred because it allowed the party or town to regroup and nominate someone better than the current live option. So in a perverse way, voting for a corpse became a form of democratic protest. It's legal. Scholar M. Todd Henderson once quipped, "Sometimes the only good candidate is a dead one because he can't disappoint you." And that's not entirely cynical. The vote for a dead candidate often reflected a desire for continuity, for respect, and for values over personalities. The corpse, in such cases, was not a joke, it was a symbol. But of what exactly? The question we'll continue exploring, because the tale of Dry Gulch is far from unique. In fact, the practice continued into the 20th century, into the age of radio and television, and even into the digital era. The question isn't why it happened once. The question is, why does it keep happening? By now, it should be clear that Elijah K. Boggs wasn't the only deceased politician to earn the confidence of voters. His quiet election in the 19th century, town of Dry Gulch may have been one of the earliest recorded instances of posthumous political success, but it certainly wasn't the last. In fact, As ballots grew more sophisticated, as technology allowed faster communication, and as the public became more cynical about the living, the dead ironically became more appealing. This section of our story explores some of the other strange elections that brought corpses into office, and how voters sometimes mournfully, sometimes mischievously, sometimes out of sheer principle cast their ballots for candidates who could no longer serve. Let us begin in Missouri, where the most famous case of all would unfold. Mel Carnahan, the senator who never sat. It was the year 2000. A U.S. Senate race in Missouri had captured national attention. The Republican incumbent, John Ashcroft, was being challenged by Mel Carnahan, the state's sitting governor and a Democrat with a solid track record. Then, in October, just 3 weeks before election day, Carnahan died in a small plane crash along with his son and a campaign advisor. His name remained on the ballot. It was too late to remove it. His widow, Jean Carnahan, announced that if Mel won, she would accept an appointment to his seat in his honor. And then came the votes. Missourians cast more than 2.7 million ballots and Mel Carnahan won by a margin of over 50,000 votes. It was the first time in U.S. history that a deceased candidate had been elected to the U.S. Senate. It wasn't just a fluke of sympathy. Voters made a deliberate choice, some out of mourning, some in protest of Ashcroft, and many in support of the late governor's legacy. Jean Carnahan was later appointed to serve in his place, fulfilling what many considered the will of the people. This wasn't an isolated, sleepy town choosing a dead mayor out of politeness. This was a full statewide election with full awareness, and a ghost candidate won. When death beats dishonor in the decades since, similar stories have surfaced across America and beyond. They all share a common theme. The voters chose symbol over substance, memory over moment, and often principle over personality. Consider these 2018. Nevada brothel owner and reality TV personality Dennis Hoff died weeks before a state assembly election. He still won the seat posthumously, defeating his Democratic opponent by nearly 7,000 votes. 2018 Pennsylvania. Voters re-elected Anthony Tony DeLuca, state representative who had passed away from lymphoma in October, simply because the ballots were already printed and early voting was underway. 2010, Brazil in a remote region, Tarirka the Clown, a popular comedian and protest candidate, was elected to Congress with over 1 million votes. Some voters later joked that even if he died, they'd re-elect him to keep corrupt politicians out. While not every one of these cases involved literal corpses, the message was the same. Voters were willing, sometimes eager, to cast their ballots for someone who could not possibly serve, simply to express something more meaningful than support. For the remaining candidates, it begs the question, can a corpse be more trustworthy than the living? The morality of a dead vote posthumous elections expose something strange and a little beautiful about democracy. When you vote for a corpse, you are making a strange sort of prayer. You're saying, this person represented something I believed in more than any living alternative does now. There's no campaign trail for the dead. No scandals to break. No speeches to regret. The candidate has said their final words and taken their final positions. Their story, for better or worse, is complete. That gives them a kind of purity. In the practical world of politics, this is absurd. But in the emotional world of people, it makes a kind of deep sense. In the case of Mel Carnahan, voters weren't electing a body, they were electing an idea, one they believed his widow could continue. In Dry Gulch, voters weren't looking for leadership, they were sending a signal. We'd rather vote for someone we trusted in death than someone we doubt in life. This was not apathy, it was agency. And in that sense, cadaver candidates are uniquely powerful. They cannot make promises, but they can still carry hope. Dead men do tell tales. We may think of the dead as silent, but in elections they often speak the loudest. In Louisiana, in 1985, a candidate who died suddenly during the campaign won posthumously, forcing a special election that drastically altered the balance of local power. In South Africa, a parliamentary candidate died the night before the election and still won. The people weren't voting for the man, they were rejecting the alternatives. There's an old, anonymous quote passed around election circles: "At least you know where a dead man stands." And that sentiment, dry as it may sound, carries with it centuries of frustration, disappointment, and distrust. To vote for the dead is not to disengage from democracy. It is, strangely, to double down. To use the tools of the system to critique the system itself. The ritual of remembering when the townspeople of Dry Gulch gathered around Elijah Boggs' coffin, they didn't just bury a man, they raised him, symbolically, spiritually, and even administratively. And when the state of Missouri turned its eyes to a sealed ballot with a dead man's name on it, the people weren't just choosing a party, they were preserving something. Every dead candidate is also a reminder that democracy is not just about the living, it is about memory, legacy, and the strange machinery we build to make decisions together. Sometimes the machine doesn't stop fast enough. Sometimes the dead get counted, and sometimes the dead win. But this raises an even more curious question, one that we'll explore in our final section of the tale. What would it mean if the dead were allowed to hold office indefinitely? What if death was not disqualification but appointment? In some places, that has happened, in temples, in villages, in cults, and in kingdoms. Next, we'll step into history's stranger shadows too. The places where dead rulers ruled the living, not just in name, but in governance. Picture this: a village on a remote hilltop. The temple bell rings, incense curls through the morning air. And sitting at the head of the council chamber, shrined in a silk robe and adorned with flowers, is the body of a man long dead. The villagers bow as they enter. Decisions are made in his name. Taxes are collected on his behalf. He is their king, their mayor, their priest, and he has been dead for years. This is not a tale of superstition or fantasy. It is a story of posthumous leadership, a tradition that has quietly endured for centuries in various corners of the world. Long before ballots and bureaucracies began tallying votes for the recently deceased. Because in many cultures, the dead never truly leave office, they transcend it. And this brings us to the final layer of our story, where the line between honor, governance, and symbolism fully dissolves. The ghost king of Jalrapatan in the princely state of Jalrapatan, what is now Rajasthan, India, a curious tradition once held firm. The Raja, once deceased, continued to be the nominal ruler of the state. His successor, the actual administrator, would govern as his regent, never assuming the full title while the previous king's spirit was still honored. He ruled in the name of the dead, was both a gesture of continuity and a spiritual anchor. To declare the king truly gone was to rupture the divine bond between people and governance. Better, they reasoned, to let the dead linger graciously, symbolically, and legally. And this was not a unique case. In the Baganda kingdom of East Africa, the body of a deceased Kabaka king was buried in a royal tomb, but the tomb itself became his palace. His widows, court officials, and advisors continued to serve him posthumously. His death did not end his reign, began his eternal incumbency. Dead popes, dead emperors, living legacies, even in Western traditions, the dead have often retained ceremonial power. When a pope dies, he is honored not just as a past spiritual leader, but often as a continuing influence. His words, teachings, and decrees are kept alive, not just as ideas, but sometimes as guiding policies. Some factions within the church have resisted new teachings by citing loyalty to long-dead pontiffs, invoking their authority as though they still ruled. The ancient Roman emperors took it further. Upon death, many emperors were deified, transformed, in law and ritual, into gods. Temples were erected in their honor. Priests served in their names. Citizens paid taxes to institutions that bore the image and divine authority of men long gone. They had become more powerful in death than they ever were in life. The inconvenient authority of corpses, and so we return to a quiet idea: the dead are often more useful than the living. They cannot change their minds. They cannot betray their word. They cannot offend, embarrass, or reform. They are stable, predictable, revered, and for systems whether spiritual, political, or social that crave continuity this can be. Convenient, a dead mayor cannot veto your bill. A dead king cannot make mistakes. A dead leader becomes an ideal land. Ideals, once buried, are difficult to dig up. When memory becomes policy, you may remember Elijah K. Boggs, the blacksmith mayor of Dry Gulch, whose memory governed longer than his breath did. In the months after his posthumous victory, the town passed a resolution naming their meeting hall after him. They issued town certificates that bore his initials. And when the next mayor was elected in a special runoff, he took office with a note of apologia, written letter addressed symbolically to Boggs, which now rests in a county archive. He was a mayor in death, longer than he had ever campaigned in life, and yet no one questioned it. No one called it a mistake. In fact, many found it comforting. And so, from the smallest American towns, to the temples of Asia, to the throne rooms of long-dead Rome, the dead have governed the living, sometimes symbolically, sometimes spiritually, sometimes bureaucratically, because they offer solutions. But because they represent something beyond disappointment, the slow drift into myth with time. The memory of a dead official often changes. It smooths over, gains edges it never had. What was once a vote cast in grief becomes a story told in reverence. Elijah Boggs becomes not just a name, but a kind of folk tale. Remember when this dead man won? Remember when we trusted the memory more than the man who was alive? And in telling that tale, a town affirms something quietly powerful, that leadership is not just action, but meaning, that trust can outlast breath, that death, oddly enough, is not the end of office, but its most honest form. A final, thoughtful step. So what does all of this mean for us? Why does it matter that corpses have won elections, ruled kingdoms, and received tax payments? Because it reminds us that governance is not just function, it is ritual, it is trust, it is memory. It is the shared belief that someone, somewhere, is acting in our best interest if they can no longer speak. We do not always elect the most competent. We do not always elect the most charismatic. Sometimes we elect the dead, not because we believe they will lead, but because we believe they once stood for something worth continuing. Maybe that's the most democratic thing of all. But as you drift now into sleep, let this quiet idea linger. What if every government carried a chair for the dead, not just to remember the past, but to remind the living what they once believed? You find yourself in a cold, stone-walled convent somewhere in 14th century Europe. The year might be 1327 or 1342. The exact date is lost to time, but the setting is familiar. The scent of candle wax lingers in the damp air. A bell tolls softly in the distance, signaling time for prayer. A group of women, robed in simple habits, move quietly through the corridors, each step measured, each word muted. Life here is defined by routine, duty, and discipline. For many, the convent is a refuge, a place of spiritual contemplation and learning. But for others, it is a prison. Our story centers on one such woman, a young nun named Isolde, a name chosen from common medieval records, as her real name remains a mystery. Isolde was born into a peasant family and entered the convent at a young age, possibly as a result of poverty or family arrangement. The decision was likely not hers. Inside the convent walls, freedom is measured by the strict daily schedule. Prayers at dawn and dusk, hours of silent work in the scriptorium or kitchen, and long days of obedience. Isolde, like many nuns, dreams quietly of a different life, one where she is not bound by vow or rule, but free to walk the streets, marry, or simply breathe unburdened. A life marked by silence. Nuns in the Middle Ages often took vows of silence or limited speech, especially during certain hours. The strictness varied between orders, but was universally a way to impose control and encourage spiritual discipline. Isolde's convent is austere. Her days are filled with weaving, gardening, and copying religious texts. The women live in near isolation. With only occasional visitors or letters from the outside world, she hears stories from older nuns of women who have escaped, but none with success. Running away from a convent was considered a grave sin, a crime punishable by imprisonment or worse. Authorities feared such escapes could bring scandal and undermine the sacred vows that formed the backbone of religious life. And yet, the desire to leave can become unbearable. First attempt. The faked death Isolaha's first plan to escape is daring and ingenious. Devises a way to fake her own death. Using herbs known to induce a death-like coma, practice recorded in some medieval herbal manuals, she manages to make her breathing shallow and pulse nearly imperceptible. The convent's healer, either complicit or unaware, confirms her death. She is laid in the convent chapel, and the sisters mourn quietly. The funeral rites are conducted, the prayers whispered. But in the dead of night, Isolde awakens. Wrapped in shrouds, she slips away through a hidden passage known only to a few senior nuns. She vanishes into the dark woods surrounding the convent. Freedom's temporary breath for a short while, Isolde tastes freedom. She finds shelter in a nearby village, disguises herself in peasant clothing, and begins to navigate the world outside. Stone walls, but life is harder than she imagined. Without money, family, or connections, she struggles to survive. The local magistrate has heard rumors of a runaway nun and orders searches. Isolde's identity becomes precarious. To be caught would mean severe punishment, perhaps return to the convent, imprisonment, or worse. After months on the run, she is recognized by a traveling merchant and handed over to the authorities. Back to the cloister, Isolde is returned. To the convent in disgrace. Her punishment is severe. Extended fasting, isolation, and public penance. But her spirit remains unbroken. She resumes her duties, but secretly plans again. The convent walls, once a prison, are now a challenge. The stakes are higher. The next escape will need to be even more clever. Here the story pauses, with Isolde. Caught between freedom and captivity, her fate uncertain. What will her next plan be? Will she find a way out? Or will the convent's walls close around her forever? After her first failed escape, Isolde's resolve hardened. The walls of the convent had closed in tighter, but the flame of freedom burned brighter within her. She had tasted the outside world, brief as it was, and now she was determined to reclaim that breath no matter the cost. Rebuilding a secret network back inside the convent, Isolde moved with quiet purpose. She was still under watch, yet she found subtle ways to communicate with the outside world. Some villagers sympathetic to the nuns' hardships began to aid, them providing messages, food, and news. Her knowledge of herbs, once only for healing or for her dangerous first ruse, now became a tool for subtle subversion. With carefully prepared potions and concoctions, she could mimic illness or induce deep sleep, buying her moments to plot and prepare. She was learning the art of survival in silence, weaving a delicate web of deception among the sisters and the local townsfolk. Calculated disappearance, Isolde's second escape plan, was even more meticulous. She realized that faking death outright was too risky. The convent's healers had grown wary, and her previous attempt was now legendary, one that her keepers would guard against fiercely. Instead, she decided to feign illness over an extended period, convincing the convent that she was weakening toward death, preparing everyone for the inevitable. During this time, she received visits from a trusted merchant, a man who had previously helped her when she first fled. He smuggled in keys and maps, and together they arranged a way for her to slip out unnoticed. On a stormy night, when the convent was dark and the sentries fewer, Isolde took her leave not with the dramatic finality of a funeral, but with the quiet step of someone walking out a back door. A new life in hiding this time, Isolde's freedom was more lasting. She found refuge in a small town, far from the convent's reach, adopting a new identity. She became a weaver, married a humble craftsman, and kept her past a secret. Her heart, however, carried the memory of captivity and the lesson that freedom was fragile. The cloisters echo back at the convent. Rumors of her escape spread like wildfire. Some nuns whispered about her daring. Others warned of punishment if she were caught. But a pseudo-story became legend, a symbol of the silent resistance many women felt, but rarely voiced. Her tale invites us to reflect on the tension between duty and desire, captivity and freedom, and the extraordinary lengths people will go to reclaim their lives. Years had passed since Isolde vanished into the world beyond the convent walls. The memory of the nun who faked her death not once, but twice, lingered in the halls she left behind and in the whispered stories of villagers and travelers. Though records of her later life are scarce, the impact of her defiance quietly rippled through the centuries. The quiet power of resistance Isolde's escapes reveal much about the constraints on women in medieval society. Convents offered stability and education, yes, but also confinement. For many young women, especially those of humble origins, the convent was a trap. Isolde's actions showed that even in the most controlled environments, the human spirit finds ways to push back. She was not a hero in grand battles or political revolutions. She was a woman seeking agency in a world that offered few choices. Faking death as a means of survival, the use of herbs to induce death-like states, was not common knowledge. But it was practiced enough to be recorded in medieval medical texts. Isolde's knowledge and use of these techniques demonstrate a practical understanding of natural science passed through generations of women healers. Her cleverness in using this knowledge for escape rather than harm shows an extraordinary will to survive and reclaim autonomy. Convent life after Isolde, her story contributed to changes in convent regulations and security. Convents became more cautious, limiting access to herbs and monitoring health more closely. Some even tightened the rules around external visitors. Isolde's escapes, while exceptional, highlighted the vulnerability of cloistered life to disruption and the persistent tension between religious duty and personal freedom. A reflection on freedom and constraint. Isolde's story asks us to consider, how do we measure freedom? Is it the absence of walls, or the ability to choose what happens within them? For Isolde, freedom was not simply physical escape, it was the reclaiming of identity and will in whatever form possible. Her life, though largely lost to history, offers a glimpse into the quiet rebellions that shaped lives behind the scenes, far from the loud chronicles of kings and wars. A question to carry forward as you settle into sleep: consider the paradox of Isolde's existence. How many lives lost to time were marked by silent struggles like hers? How many people have faked their own deaths in history, not just to flee danger, but to step into freedom? And what lessons do these quiet acts hold for us today in our own quests for autonomy and meaning? Imagine a small village nestled in the rolling hills of England, sometime in the early 18th century. The year is perhaps 1723 or 1731, no one quite remembers. At the center of this village stands a church with a tall, proud steeple. The steeple is a clock, large and intricate, its face worn by decades of weather and countless chimes that mark the passage of time. But there is something peculiar about this clock. It stopped working, not for an hour or a day or a week, but indefinitely. It never started again. The importance of time in the 18th century, clocks in village churches were more than just devices, or the heartbeat of rural life. Villagers relied on the church clock to regulate their days, when to start work in the fields, when to pause for meals, and when to gather for community meetings or worship. The clock tower was the village's unofficial timekeeper, coordinating the rhythm of labor and leisure. But when the clock stopped, the village faced a new challenge: how to live by time that no longer ticked forward. The broken clock's consequences. The clock's hands froze at precisely 3:17. Some villagers insisted the time was sacred, as a marker for prayer and reflection. Others grumbled that without the clock's chimes, the fields would go untended and chaos would seep into daily life. Yet, as weeks turned to months, the village adapted. The miller timed his grinds by the sun, the blacksmith worked by the rising and setting of light. Children learned the seasons by the blossoming of flowers rather than by the hour. The broken clock became both a burden and a symbol. A town's relationship with time, the villagers' gradual shift away from clock time. Two natural rhythms reflected a larger truth. Time is not just measured by machines, but by human experience in the environment. Their lives became slower, less regimented by mechanical precision and more attuned to nature's cycles. Some historians suggest this shift made the community closer knit, less rushed, and more resilient. Yet it also isolated them from the increasingly industrial world beyond their hills where clocks ruled factories and cities. Why did the clock stop? No one knows exactly why the clock broke. Some say it was a mechanical failure, gears worn thin, springs snapped. Others whisper of superstition that the clock was cursed after a tragic event. Perhaps a death in the churchyard, or a dispute among villagers. Attempts to repair the clock were made, but funds were scarce, and skilled clockmakers were few. Eventually, the broken clock became a fixture, a reminder of both impermanence and continuity. An unanswered question: what does it mean to measure time when the clock no longer works? How does a community maintain order when the usual markers fall silent? And how do people find meaning in the pause, in the stillness? These questions echo far beyond this village, touching on how we understand and live through time itself. In the months and years following the clock's stoppage, the village settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. The absence of its steady ticking was not just a technical issue, but a shift in how the community related to the passing of days and seasons. Without the clock's chimes to mark hours, people began relying on more ancient natural signs to order their lives. The role of nature as timekeeper, the sun, became the village's chief guide. Farmers rose with the first light, gauged their work by the sun's position, and rested as dusk fell. Birdsong signaled morning. The silence of nightfall marked the end of daily labor. Seasons became more pronounced markers of time, planting in spring, harvesting in summer and fall, and preparing for winter's cold. Church bells still rang for Mass, but their tolls were no longer tied to precise hours, more to the flow of the community's needs. Adapting work and social life without a mechanical clock, workdays became flexible. The miller adjusted grinding times to daylight. The blacksmith worked while the forge fire burned brightest and rested when smoke drifted too thick. Community events, such as markets and festivals, shifted from being fixed on specific hours to being called by local customs and word of mouth. The lack of strict timing seemed to soften daily life. Routines were less pressured, more communal. The lost and found in time's pause, however, the lack of precision did have its drawbacks. Traders from nearby towns found the village schedule erratic. Letters arrived with uncertain timing. Some deliveries missed their mark. The villagers' world became inward-looking, less connected to the pace of the growing industrial age surrounding them. Still, this slowness fostered resilience and self-reliance. Attempts to fix the clock over the decades, several repair attempts were made. Local craftsmen and itinerant clockmakers tried to bring the tower's heart back to life. Each time, the village raised funds through communal efforts fairs, collections, and donations. But the clock's inner mechanisms were old and fragile. Repairs often failed or only lasted briefly. Eventually, the community accepted the clock's broken state as permanent. A symbol of change, the broken clock became a symbol both of loss and endurance. It reminded villagers of how time, technology, and tradition intertwine. It marked a moment when the community chose to slow down, to embrace natural rhythms, and to prioritize connection over precision. The unresolved question, so the village faced an open question: was the broken clock a failure to keep up, or a quiet triumph of human adaptation? And in the long, slow pulse of days without mechanical time, what did it mean to live fully? Decades passed, and the clock on the church steeple remained stubbornly still at 3:17. Its silent face bore witness to generations who lived their lives untethered from its mechanical pulse. The village around it changed slowly, but the clock's quiet stillness became a comforting presence, a monument to a different way of being. Time is experience, not measurement without the clock's rhythm. Villagers grew to experience time not as segmented hours, but as flowing cycles. Children learned to tell time by observing nature, the position of the sun, the crowing of roosters, and the blooming of flowers. Farmers planned sowing and harvesting by the weather and seasons, not by watches or bells. Life's pace was gentle. more attuned to the body's needs than a clock's demands. The wider world marches on beyond the village. The world was racing forward. The Industrial Revolution was beginning, machines pounding out time in strict beats, factories opening and closing by the hour, trains running on tight schedules, and cities bustling with clock watches and deadlines. Yet this village remained an island of stillness. To some, it was quaint and backward. To others, it was a refuge. The broken clock's quiet influence in time. The story of the village and its broken clock became a symbol in philosophical discussions about time and human life. Thinkers pondered how much of our experience is dictated by the mechanical measurement of time and how much comes from lived moments and natural rhythms. The village posed an implicit challenge. Can slowing down reveal a fuller, more human way to live? An invitation to reflection as you drift towards sleep. Consider this. What if the clocks that govern your day stopped? Would your life unravel? Or would you find new rhythms? Could living by the flow of nature, rather than the tick of gears, restore something lost in our hurried world? And what does it mean to truly measure time? In the silence of that still clock face, the village offers an invitation one to embrace. The slow, steady pulse of life beyond the hours. Picture a small farmstead somewhere in northern Europe during the late 1600s. A farmer named Jan works the land, a patchwork of fields, pastures, and hedgerows. His days are spent sowing grain, tending livestock, and repairing fences. Jan's life is marked by hard work and simple routines. Seasons dictate his tasks, and the cycles of nature shape his world. One day, in the course of his usual work, Jan makes a seemingly trivial decision, one that will lead to a slow but remarkable transformation. The origin of the forest. Jan clears a patch of overgrown brush near the edge of his field. Among the cuttings, he tosses piles of brush and seeds onto a neglected corner, intending to clear it for planting the next spring. But the soil there is poor, and the area is inconvenient to cultivate. So Jan neglects it. Over the following years, seedlings begin to sprout. Wild saplings take root: oak, ash, and birch. Slowly, what was once forgotten land starts to fill with trees. Jan, busy with his daily labor, hardly notices at first. The unintended growth: the saplings grow, and the neglected patch becomes a small grove. As decades pass, it expands a quiet, accidental forest. Villagers nearby start calling it Jan's wood, even though Jan himself never set out to plant a forest. His simple act of clearing and dumping brush unintentionally started a process of natural regeneration. The farmer's relationship to nature. Jan's story reflects a common truth in agrarian life. The boundaries between human activity and nature are porous. Farmers shape the landscape, yes, but the land shapes them too. Jan's forest grows slowly, silently, a testament to nature's resilience and the unintended consequences of human action. Slow transformation. This accidental forest will provide shelter for wildlife, fuel for fires, and wood for tools. It becomes a quiet part of the community's ecology, a living legacy. But its origins are humble and easily overlooked, just a farmer's forgotten brush pile. An open thought: what does it mean to create something lasting without meaning to? How does time transform small, simple actions into monumental change? And how do humans shape nature even when they try not to? The tree saplings, nourished by wind-blown seeds and bird droppings, multiply. Oaks spread their acorns, birches scatter their tiny seeds, and ash trees drop their winged fruits. Each season sees new growth, filling the once barren corner with greenery. The forest floor becomes home to mosses, ferns, and wildflowers. Animals are birds of opses, and birds find refuge in the trees and underbrush. A changing landscape. The villagers gradually take note. What was once considered wasteland is now valuable woodland, providing timber, firewood, and a place for gathering herbs and berries. Jan himself begins to appreciate the forest's presence, though he did not plant it intentionally. He recognizes its importance for his family's survival and the village's well-being. Human and nature, an unplanned partnership. Jan's story exemplifies the complex relationship between humans and the environment.
Oh.
Though his goal was simple clearing land for crops, nature had other plans. The forest's growth shows how ecosystems can recover and thrive when left undisturbed. Legacy beyond intention, Jan's forest reminds us that some of the most enduring changes come not from grand designs, but from small, often accidental acts. His forgotten brush pile became a living, breathing part of the landscape, offering shelter, resources, and beauty for generations. An unresolved thought: how many of our actions ripple quietly through time, shaping the world without our awareness. What other accidental legacies have we left behind, waiting to be discovered? And in a world increasingly shaped by deliberate planning, what room is there for nature's slow, patient reclaiming? Decades after Jan's simple act of clearing brush, the forest stands taller, quiet testament to nature's resilience and the unforeseen power of small choices. Though Jan himself has long passed, his accidental forest continues to shape the lives of those who live nearby. The forest as community resource, the woodland provides wood for fires, timber for building, and food for villagers who gather berries and nuts. It becomes a place of gathering, a natural meeting spot for the community, where stories are shared beneath the canopy. A reminder of interconnectedness, Jan's forest reminds us that human life is deeply entwined with nature. Our actions, no matter how small or accidental, ripple through ecosystems in ways we cannot always foresee. This forest stands not as a monument to human design, but to the slow, patient work of nature reclaiming and renewing. Reflection on time and change, the slow growth of the forest contrasts sharply with the rapid pace of modern life. Us to pause and consider how time unfolds differently in nature, measured not in minutes or hours, but in seasons, years, and generations. A final thought as you drift into sleep: imagine the quiet spread of leaves overhead, the rustling of branches in a gentle breeze. Consider the legacy we all leave behind, intentional or not, and wonder how many forests, literal or metaphorical, grow quietly because of choices made long ago. Imagine a small village nestled deep in the mountains of Tibet, where the air is thin and the wind carries ancient whispers. The year is approximately 1800, though records are sparse. And the village is known simply as Syringa, name meaning long life in the local language. This village is remarkable for one very unusual reason. For over a century, its inhabitants took a vow of silence, a promise made in sorrow. The story begins with a tragedy. According to oral history, Syringa suffered a devastating loss when a deadly epidemic swept through the valley, claiming many lives. The survivors, grieving and fearful, believed the sickness was a punishment for their harsh words and conflicts. In response, the village elders gathered and declared a vow: no speaking would be allowed in Syringa until the sins of the past were atoned for and the village found peace. The weight of silence, this vow transformed daily life. Words, once the bridge between people, became rare and sacred. Villagers communicated through gestures, written notes, and expressions. Children learned from an early age to listen deeply, to read the silence as much as they would have listened to voices. Daily life and quiet without speech, tasks took on new meaning. Farmers tended crops in silence, relying on intuition and careful observation. Families gathered for meals without chatter, sharing moments of calm. Silence became a form of meditation, a collective breath held across generations. Challenges and adaptations, the vow was difficult. Misunderstandings increased without words. To clarify, visitors found the village eerie or unwelcoming. Yet, the people of Syringa found strength in the discipline of silence. Their relationships deepened, grounded in presence rather than speech. An open question: what does it mean to live without words? Can silence be a language of connection rather than isolation? And how does a community sustain such a vow for a century? The vow of silence was not merely a punishment or a ritual. It became the fabric of Syringa's identity. For generations, the villagers adapted, leaving a life without spoken words, transforming silence from absence into presence. Communication without speech, the villagers developed intricate systems of non-verbal communication. Hand signals, facial expressions, and body language took on nuanced meanings. Children were taught from a young age to read these cues, learning to sense emotion and intention without a single syllable. Scribes and artists became vital. Written notes, carved signs, and painted symbols replaced conversation. The act of writing took on sacred importance, a way to express the unspoken heart. Silence, as a social bond, silence fostered patience and attentiveness. Arguments, once fueled by heated words, became rare. Disputes were resolved through mediation, gestures, and shared silence rather than shouting matches. The village elders who guided the community relied on ritual and example rather than speech to maintain order. The spiritual dimension, silence, was also a spiritual practice. The villagers believed that words, if careless, carried harm. By refraining from speech, they sought to purify their thoughts and lives. Meditative silence was woven into daily prayer and work. In this way, the vow connected them deeply to each other, to their land, and to their faith. The burden of isolation, yet silence, was not without cost. Trade with neighboring communities declined as communication grew difficult. Some villagers left unable to bear the quiet. Visitors often misunderstood or feared the silent village, reinforcing Suring's isolation. A thought to hold as you listen quietly, consider this. How does silence shape our relationships? Can a community find unity not in words, but in shared stillness? And what might we learn from those who live long without speech? After 100 years of silence, the village of Suring reached a moment of quiet transformation. The vow, once rigid and absolute, began to soften, not with a dramatic breaking, but with a gentle reawakening of sound. The first words spoken, the elders gathered and decided it was time to end the vow. They believed the village had atoned, that peace had been restored. The first words spoken were simple: greetings, blessings, and expressions of gratitude. These voices were hesitant, fragile like seedlings breaking through winter's thaw. Relearning speech for many villagers, speaking was unfamiliar and awkward. Children born during the silent century had never heard the spoken word. Began in whisper and song. Slowly, conversations returned, layered now with the deep understanding forged by years of silence. A changed community, though the voice returned, the village's identity had transformed. Silence remained a valued part of life. Periods of quiet reflection and meditation became common. Words were used more thoughtfully, with greater respect. For their power, the balance between speech and silence created a new rhythm. Lessons Beyond the Valley, the story of Suring, invites us to reflect on the power of silence, not as absence, but as presence. It challenges modern assumptions about communication and connection. In a world full of noise, perhaps there is wisdom in listening more and speaking less. A final reflection as you settle into sleep. Imagine the quiet mountains surrounding Suring. Hear the gentle breath of the wind, the soft rustle of leaves. And consider this. What might your life be like if silence was not empty, but full? In a quiet village nestled in the rolling hills of 16th century Ireland, there lived a farmer named Seamus O'Connell. Known for his modest farm and hard-working nature, Seamus was an ordinary man by most accounts. But a curious story spread throughout the county, one that would echo for centuries. It was said that Seamus had cows, whose milk was somehow transformed into gold. The origins of the legend, this tale likely began as a metaphor, or a misunderstanding, but grew into local folklore. Stories told of how Seamus's cattle grazed on a particular patch of grass near a mineral-rich spring. Villagers whispered that the water and earth infused the milk with a strange golden quality. Whether true or not, the legend grew, inspiring awe, curiosity, and even envy. A farmer's daily life? Seamus's real life was much humbler. He tended to. He's herd with care, milking the cows twice daily, repairing fences, and preparing for harsh winters. His days were long, marked by routines that tied him closely to the land and the changing seasons. The economic impact, the story of golden milk, brought travelers, merchants, and curious nobles to Seamus's doorstep. Some sought to buy the miraculous milk, others to investigate its origins. The influx brought new challenges, questions of authenticity, competition, and suspicion. An unanswered question: did Seamus truly possess cows that produced gold? Or was this story a symbol of hope, a reflection of human desire for prosperity? And what does this tale tell us about the power of myth in rural communities? As the legend of Seamus O'Connell's golden cows spread beyond his village, more people grew eager to understand the truth behind the tale. Was this an extraordinary natural phenomenon, or simply a story born from imagination and hope? Investigating the source, curious travelers and local officials came to inspect the farm. Some sampled the milk, hoping to see a literal shimmer of gold. Others examined the cow's diet, the soil, and the nearby spring. What they found was ordinary milk, rich but not golden. The cows were healthy, thanks in part to the mineral-rich waters, but the milk's appearance was normal. Still, the story persisted. The power of symbolism: scholars and folklorists later interpreted the tale as symbolic rather than literal. The golden milk may have represented the richness and fertility of the land, the prosperity of a hardworking farmer, or the hope for a better future in challenging times. In a world where wealth was scarce, stories like these provided comfort and inspiration. Economic and social effects: whether true or not, the story brought real benefits to Seamus and his community. Visitors bought dairy products, bartered goods, and exchanged news. The farm became a hub of local activity, strengthening social bonds. Lessons from the legend: the tale highlights how myths can shape economies and societies, even when detached from literal truth. It reminds us that human beings have long used stories to explain, inspire, and endure. An open question: what does the story of golden milk tell us about the relationship between fact and belief? How do myths influence our perception of reality? And can a story, even if untrue, hold real power? Over time, Seamus O'Connell's farm returned to quiet normalcy. The cows produced ordinary milk, and the initial frenzy of visitors slowed. Yet the story of the golden cows persisted not as a literal fact, but as a legend woven into the fabric of local culture. A tale that transcends time, the myth became a symbol of hope and prosperity for a community often faced with hardship. It reminded villagers that even in modest circumstances, there was potential for something extraordinary. Myth as a social glue: legends like Seamus's golden milk helped foster identity and cohesion. They created shared stories that connected people across generations. The tale also served as a cautionary reminder of human desire and the allure of wealth. Reflecting on human nature, the story prompts reflection on why people are drawn to myths and legends. It suggests that humans seek meaning beyond mere facts, looking for stories that inspire, explain, or promise transformation. A thought to end on as you settle into sleep. Consider this: what stories shape your understanding of the world? How do myths, whether true or false, influence the way communities live and grow? And in your own life, what golden moments might be found, not in literal treasure, but in meaning and connection? In a quiet town nestled along the Rhine River in Germany, sometime in the late 17th century, an unusual tradition took root. The town of Elsenburg became known for an annual festival celebrated every year for half a century, but with one striking feature: there was no music. The origin of the silent festival: the story began with a solemn vow made after a devastating fire swept through Elsenburg. The fire destroyed much of the town and claimed many lives. In grief and remembrance, the town council decreed that, for 50 years, the festival would be celebrated in silence, without music, without dancing. The silent festival became a way to honor the past and show resilience, a festival like no other. Each year, on the anniversary of the fire, townspeople gathered in the main square. Instead of the usual fanfare, they observed moments of quiet reflection. They lit candles, shared stories, and offered prayers, all without musical accompaniment. The role of silence in mourning, the absence of music, created a space for solemnity. It allowed the community to collectively process loss and to remember those who had been lost. Life goes on despite the silence. Life in Elsenburg continued with its usual rhythms. The festival became a symbol of endurance, a reminder that joy and sorrow could coexist. An open question: how does silence shape our experience of grief and remembrance? Can a festival without music still be a celebration? What happens when the silence finally ends? For 50 years, the people of Elsenburg observed their festival in silence. This wasn't just an absence of music, it was a deliberate communal choice to hold space for reflection and respect. As generations passed, the silent festival became a defining feature of the town's identity. Adapting tradition without music, the festival's other elements grew in importance. Storytelling, poetry, and communal meals became the heart of the celebration. Elders shared memories of the fire and the town's recovery, passing wisdom to the young. Children learned to listen carefully not only to words, but also to the unspoken feelings carried in the silence. Community and connection, the silence, fostered a unique form of togetherness. In the absence of song and dance, people found other ways to express shared grief and hope. A simple touch, a quiet smile, or the lighting of a candle conveyed more than words or music ever could. The festival was a space where sorrow and resilience coexisted, where the community reaffirmed its strength. Challenges and criticism, not everyone embraced the silence. Some younger villagers found it oppressive or sad. They yearned for the joy and energy that music could bring. Debates occasionally arose about ending the vow early, but tradition held strong. A question to ponder: what does it mean to celebrate without sound? Can silence itself become a language of remembrance and healing? And how does a community decide when it is time to move from mourning to celebration? After 5 decades, the year arrived when the vow of silence was to be lifted. The town of Elsenburg prepared to celebrate not only the anniversary of survival, but also the return of music. The first notes on the appointed day, the church bell rang out not in mourning, but in joy. Musicians, some from neighboring towns, gathered to play once more. The air filled with melodies, some somber, others lively. The return of music was both exhilarating and bittersweet, as it carried the weight of memory and the promise of renewal. A community transformed. The silent years had changed Elsenburg. People spoke of having learned a deeper appreciation for sound, not taking music for granted. The festival now blended the solemnity of silence with the vibrancy of song. It became a celebration of resilience, memory, and life's rhythms. Reflections on silence and sound, Elsenburg's story invites us to consider the role silence and sound play in our lives. Sometimes silence is needed to heal. Other times, sound is needed to celebrate. Silence between the two creates space for meaning. Final thought as you settle into sleep. Imagine the quiet square, once filled with stillness, now alive with music and laughter. Consider the power of silence and the joy of its return, and reflect on how moments of stillness can prepare us to appreciate the music in our lives. In a small town in 15th century France, a baker named Matthew ran a modest bakery on a quiet street. His days were filled with the scent of fresh bread and the steady rhythm of kneading dough. Life was simple, but hard. Bread was essential, the daily staple that fed the community. Yet taxes from the king weighed heavily on both farmers and tradespeople alike. One day, Matthew received an unexpected visitor, the king's tax collector. The tax collector's visit, the collector arrived with an imposing entourage, demanding payment to cover the king's expenses, wars, castles, and court festivities far from the baker's humble life. Matthew had little to give, but the tax collector expected his due. What followed was a negotiation marked by tension, strategy, and quiet determination. Bread as currency and bargaining chip, Matthew offered fresh loaves, baked with care, as partial payment. The tax collector, initially dismissive, found himself intrigued by the baker's skill and the community's reliance on his bread. The exchange highlighted how everyday goods like bread became part of larger economic and political systems. Life under taxation, this story sheds light on the burdens ordinary people bore in medieval Europe. Taxes funded kings and nobles, but often strained the livelihoods of common folk. Yet, within these pressures, small acts of negotiation and survival unfolded daily. An open question: how did people like Matthew navigate the demands of authority while sustaining their families? And how can the story of a simple loaf of bread reveal larger truths about power and survival? After the tax collector's initial visit, Matthew found himself in a precarious position. His bakery was not just a place of work, but a cornerstone of the community, providing sustenance for families who depended on his bread. Yet the demands of royal taxation threatened to consume much of his modest profits. The art of bargaining medieval taxation was not merely a fixed demand, but often involved negotiation, barter, and occasional evasion. Tax collectors operated with some discretion, balancing the king's expectations against the realities of local economies. Matthew, aware of his importance to the town, used his position to negotiate. Offering bread in lieu of full monetary payment was a way to fulfill obligations while keeping his business afloat. Bread as social currency in a time when coin was scarce. Goods like bread served as currency within communities and between commoners and officials. Matthew's bakery became a microcosm of this economy, where food, favors, and payments intertwined. The tax collector, recognizing this, sometimes accepted bread and other goods, knowing they held tangible value. The community's role, neighbors, supported Matthew, understanding the pressures he faced. Some helped by sharing grain or assisting in the bakery, reinforcing the communal nature of survival in harsh times. This collective resilience was vital in a world where official power was often distant and impersonal. An unresolved question: how did ordinary people balance obedience to authority with the need to protect their livelihoods? What strategies did communities develop to survive under heavy taxation? And how might these quiet acts of resistance and adaptation echo in modern struggles? As seasons passed, Matthew's bakery endured, not just because of his skill with dough, but because of his resilience and tact in navigating the demands of power. The story of the baker and the tax collector became a small but meaningful chapter in the broader history of medieval survival. Small acts, big impact, though the tax collector represented the distant authority of the crown. It was the everyday negotiations of people like Matthew that shaped how royal policies were experienced on the ground. By offering bread instead of full monetary tribute, Matthew ensured his family's survival and kept his community fed. His quiet resistance preserved a way of life under pressure. The bread is symbol, bread, a humble staple, symbolized more than nourishment. It was currency, bargaining power, and connection. Matthew's loaf carried the weight of survival amid political and economic forces beyond his control. Reflection. On power and survival, this story invites you to think about the ways ordinary people navigate power, sometimes through compliance, sometimes through subtle defiance. It highlights human resilience and adaptability in the face of overwhelming demands. A thought to end on as you drift towards sleep: imagine the warm scent of freshly baked bread, the quiet tension of negotiation, and the strength found in small acts. Consider how survival often depends not on grand gestures, but on everyday choices and quiet courage. Along the winding banks of the Elbe River in Central Europe lies the town of Dornfelde, a small settlement with a long and troubled relationship with water. For over a century, Dornfeld endured repeated flooding. The river, both a source of life and destruction, claimed homes, crops, and livelihoods with relentless persistence. The first floods, the flooding began in the early 1500s. Seasonal rains and snowmelt caused the river to swell beyond its banks, inundating fields and streets. Villagers watched helplessly as their homes were submerged and their hard-won harvests washed away. The floods returned year after year, each one chipping away at the town's resilience. Living with uncertainty, life in Dornfeld was a constant balance between hope and fear. Residents built makeshift levees and raised their homes on stilts, but the river's power was often overwhelming. Communities banded together to repair damage and share resources, finding strength in cooperation. A cycle of loss and renewal despite the destruction. The floods also brought fertile silt, enriching the soil for future crops. This paradox made the river both enemy and ally. The townspeople learned to live with the cycle of devastation and regeneration, accepting water's dual nature. An open question: how does a community endure when nature's forces seem endlessly against them? What motivates people to rebuild again and again? And how does living with uncertainty shape a town's character as the years turned into decades? The people of Dornfeld developed strategies to cope with the relentless flooding. Their resilience was not merely a matter of endurance, but a series of practical adaptations rooted in observation, communal effort, and cautious hope. Engineering against the river villagers began constructing levees and embankments along the riverbanks. These earthen barriers, though rudimentary, were vital defenses against rising waters. Communities organized seasonal efforts to reinforce these structures, often calling upon every able-bodied member to contribute labor. Though these measures did not guarantee safety, they reduced the worst of the damage. Elevating the village homes and barns were built or raised on stilts and platforms, elevating living spaces above expected flood levels. This architectural adjustment allowed families to maintain some semblance of normal life, even during high water. Communal buildings, churches, meeting halls were similarly raised or relocated to higher ground when possible. Seasonal migration and preparation. Many families developed seasonal migration patterns, retreating to safer areas during flood-prone months. They stored food and livestock in elevated granaries or moved them temporarily to unaffected regions. The community's calendar became intimately linked to the rhythms of the river. The role of faith and tradition. Floods were often seen as both natural events and spiritual tests. Prayers, rituals, and festivals emerged to honor water spirits or saints believed to protect the town. These practices provided psychological comfort and a sense of control amid chaos. A question to carry forward in facing constant threat: how do communities balance practical survival with spiritual hope? What does it mean to live in a place where danger is woven into everyday life? And how might such experiences shape a collective identity over generations? After a century of relentless floods, Dornfeld emerged transformed not merely as a town battered by nature's force, but as a community deeply intertwined with the river's rhythms, a town reborn through generations of rebuilding. The people of Dornfeld adapted their architecture, culture, and economy to the water's presence. Floods were no longer just disasters, but moments within a larger cycle of life. The town's identity grew rooted in this understanding, a blend of respect, pragmatism, and perseverance. The river as life-giver, the fertile silt deposited by the floods enriched the land, allowing for abundant harvests in better years. Fishing and river trade became essential parts of the local economy, turning the river from adversary to vital resource. Legacy of community. Dornfeld's story is one of communal strength. It was the collective efforts, raising levees, sharing resources, and passing knowledge that sustained the town through hardship. Reflection on human endurance. This tale reminds us that resilience is often forged not in moments of triumph, but in the quiet, repeated acts of rebuilding. It invites us to consider how people live alongside natural forces that cannot be controlled, but must be respected. A final thought as you settle into sleep: imagine the flowing river, sometimes fierce, sometimes gentle, carrying away the old and bringing the new. Consider the courage in rebuilding again and again, and reflect on how, like Dornfeld, we all face floods in our own lives, some visible, some silent. In a small village nestled in the valleys of medieval Persia lived a weaver named Lela. Her loom was more than just a toolet, was a storyteller's instrument. Through threads of wool and silk, she wove not only patterns but tales passed down through generations. The art of weaving was a daily labor, but also a deeply meaningful craft. Leela's patterns told stories of heroes, lovers, battles, and peace. Each design was carefully planned, with symbols recognized by villagers as chapters in a shared history. Cloth is memory. In an era before widespread literacy, cloth served as a record keeper. Families preserved tapestries and rugs not just for their beauty, but for the stories woven into them. Leela's work connected past and present, weaving history into the fabric of daily life. The weaver's role in the community. Leela's craft made her a keeper of culture. She was respected not only for her skill, but also for her knowledge of the stories embedded in the patterns. Visitors from nearby towns sought her tapestries, eager to carry the tales back to their own homes. An open question: how do crafts preserve memory when words are scarce? What role do artists play in shaping and sustaining cultural identity? And how might a single thread connect countless stories over time? Leela's weaving was more than mere craft, it was a living archive of her people's history, beliefs, and values. Each tapestry carried layers of meaning, visible to those who knew how to read its patterns. The language of patterns, symbols, and Leela's cloth told stories without words. A rising sun might signify hope or rebirth. Intertwined vines could represent family ties. A lone falcon might speak of courage. Villagers could read the cloth, recalling tales of ancestors, battles, and festivals through these motifs. Passing down tradition, Leela taught her apprentices not only how to weave, but also how to understand the stories embedded in each thread. This tradition ensured that the village's collective memory would endure beyond individual lifetimes. Weaving in changing times as trade routes opened and new materials arrived, Leela incorporated unfamiliar threads and dyes into her work. Her tapestries began to reflect not only local stories, but also influences from distant lands. Persia's vast cultural crossroads at work. An unresolved thought: what stories do we carry in the things we create? How do crafts preserve culture when spoken or written history is fragile? And what becomes of these stories when their meanings are forgotten? Leela's tapestries outlived her, passing from hand to hand, village to village, carrying stories through centuries. Though the world changed around them, these cloths remained a tangible link to the past. Stories that transcend time even when the original meanings faded. The patterns inspired new generations, sparking curiosity, pride, and a sense of belonging. The cloth became a symbol not just of history, but of continuity and identity. The weaver's last gift, Leela's apprentices spread her techniques and stories beyond their home, ensuring the art of storytelling through weaving survived. Her loom was said to carry a spirit, a reminder that every thread is part of a larger story. Reflection on memory and art. This story reminds us that art preserves memory in ways words cannot always reach. It invites us to consider the silent. Histories woven into everyday objects, thought to drift with as you settle into sleep. Imagine the soft touch of thread and fabric, the gentle rhythm of the loom. Consider the stories woven into the world around you, waiting to be read, remembered, and retold.